Bob Reinovsky kicks off the summer program tonight with his talk entitled, Why Do Faith and Reason Interact? An introduction to the summer series. Here's a short bio on Bob. Bob Reinovsky received a PhD from Rensselaer Polytech Institute and came to Los Alamos after serving in and working for the U.S. Air Force for 13 years. At Los Alamos National Laboratory, where he is a program manager, his research activities have included work in plasma physics, pulse power, magnetohydrodynamics, and material response. From 1992 to 2014, he also worked on a scientific and cultural outreach to the Russian Federal Nuclear Centers and the closed cities in Russia where they are located. He's a fellow of the IEEE and a member of White Rock Presbyterian Church, where he is an ordained elder, and he has served as the monitor of the Presbytery of Santa Fe. He is a founding member, vice president, and past secretary of the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum. And before I turn the program over to Bob, here's just a few logistics about our live stream presentation. We are recording the presentation tonight as we do every week. If you are uncomfortable with being a part of a recording of our time together, please leave the meeting now. We will be making the recordings available soon. You can modify your display name in the box with your image. Please let us know who you are. During the talk, you can type your question into the chat, the Zoom chat. Okay, if you don't know about chat, you can find the chat feature. You look on the Zoom menu bar. You might have to move your cursor in the window with your name and picture to make the app menu bar appear. You'll either see a chat icon in the menu bar, or you might need to click more in the menu bar to find the chat option. After the talk, we will relay the questions to Bob. And please limit your use of chat to everyone to questions for the speaker. We may have time for some live questions, answers, and discussions after we address the questions in the chat. During the question and answer period, you may use the raise your hand feature next to your name in the participants panel. You can find the participants panel icon near the chat icon in the Zoom ribbon. We'll try to watch that panel to give everyone a chance to, if they have a question or a comment at the end. If you wish, you can download the slides for tonight's presentation from our website at any time. And on the website, you can also add your comments about tonight's lecture. Okay, let's get started. I'll turn this over to Bob now, and we'll monitor questions or comments coming in on the chat for discussion later. I hope you enjoy the talk. Okay, now what happens?
Thanks very much, Dan.
Thank you.
Nope, I'm here.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Great. Okay. Yeah, okay.
This is lecture number 1 of our summer series. It's an introduction to the series, and I've almost adopted the title of the series as the title of this introductory lecture. And so my title is, Why Can or Should Faith and Reason Interact? Now, it's not always completely transparent that faith and reason even do interact, and we're going to touch on that issue a little bit here as we talk through our time together tonight. I'm really presenting this introduction to the summer series on behalf of the board of directors. Very little of what I'm going to talk about is my own thinking, and it really draws from the work of many, many people who have put a lot of time and energy into preparing for the series. My purpose tonight is to give you kind of a preview of an exciting series of explorations over the next few weeks. And that's where all the real content will emerge. Here's a brief outline of what I'd like to talk about tonight. The role and mission of the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum sort of provides a little opportunity to set the context for the topics that we're addressing this week. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the program. Dan said a few things. I'm going to say a few more things about the forum. I want to talk a little bit about the big questions at the intersection of faith and reason. And those big questions are kind of topics that have been cueing us over the last few years. Why is there even a question about the interaction of faith and reason, religion and science? Talk a little bit about that. I'll offer some perspectives on what drives these two ways of thinking and drives them to really interact. And I'll talk in detail about 2 out of a list of about 6. And then I'll finish with a quick summary of the summer program. So the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum, you heard some of this from Dan earlier. It was founded in 2014. It's a group of scientists, engineers, clergy, and laity here in Los Alamos, helping each other and our community. Who's the community? Community is you guys, people who are interested in the topic and are willing to join us on an occasional or maybe regular basis to engage in some of this dialogue, thinking about science and religion, the harmony and complementarity of these two modes of being and knowing. And we do that by providing some information, a little bit of education, but mostly this framework for talking about things. The forum articulates its purpose as inviting the religious and scientific communities to join in living deeply into the mysteries of religion and of science, and to do so by looking deeply into both. We're committed to explore both the discoveries and the mysteries of science and religion, largely through the big questions that I referred to earlier. The work of the forum is supported largely by private gifts, by dues to the forum, which are really very modest, and by the support of several local Los Alamos churches, including Bethlehem Lutheran Church, First United Methodist, IHM Catholic Community, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Trinity on the Hill Episcopal, and White Rock Presbyterian Church. In the process of looking deeply into the mysteries of science and religion, we've observed 2 things. One, there are 2 fundamental approaches to begin the processing of information. Revelation, which is sort of the approach taken by the point of view of faith, and physical observation, the point of view that is adopted by those who approach questions from the standpoint of reason. There are 2 human institutions, institutionalizations of those ways of processing information, 2 sort of applications of the outcome of this kind of processing. Those 2 human institutionalizations are religion and our science. So we make this distinction between approaches and institutionalizations. We named the forum the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum because the Los Alamos Faith and Reason, Religion and Science Forum was just too big a mouthful. I sometimes like to use the acronym FRR and S to refer to faith and reason, religion and science, those combined disciplines together. The work of the forum includes a number of aspects that we adopt. We like to think we are approaching our studies from accessible theology and accessible science. We like to pursue study and academic discussion basically at kind of the undergraduate level. We're inviting older youth, undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs, congregational members, community, adults, and retirees into a dialogue. It's a dialogue that initially started aimed at trying to address the needs of undergraduates and graduate students and perhaps postdocs. We've kind of broadened our audience, but boy, we would appreciate any insight that any folks in the community have about how to better address the needs of folks in undergraduate, late high school, undergraduate, and graduate school. So if you have any ideas, feel free to pass them on. We tend to engage local speakers. You're going to hear those in this summer series, and some nationally known invited speakers as well. I'm going to talk about a couple of those in just a minute or 2. We're aiming to develop a year-round program. Well, that idea got derailed a little bit in 2020 and 2021 by COVID. But we're trying to get back on track and taking advantage of this Zoom medium. We're able to reach out even a little bit wider than we were with our in-person program. We're continuing to support some reading and study groups. We have a fledgling writers group and some exchanges with other similar organizations around the state, this summer program and some other programs as well. You can find more information about the forum at the website, and the splash page for the website looks a little bit like this, where on the left side you can find information about previous summer programs. You can find some abstracts going back several years, and as well as some annual reports that kind of summarize the work of the forum as well. The photo here, interestingly enough, is a Professor John Houck. He's from Georgetown University. He was our guest in the summer of 2017, and we can see him here addressing a full house at Fuller Lodge. As the forum, we aim to provide a venue for community dialogue, and we like to start thinking about the big questions that sort of exist at the intersection of science and religion, because those big questions tend to drive the intellectual life of both science and religion and the discussion between them. So what are big questions? Who are we? Questions of consciousness, self-awareness, questions about what makes us human, questions about how does our body work, neurology, psychology, physiology, and brain science, questions about how does our mind work, questions of free will. How do we make choices? Do we make choices? Really? Another big question, where do we come from? Where do we come from reaches back to cosmological kinds of timescales and events, including the Big Bang, essential origins, and essentially very large spatial scales. But we also come from the micro world of quantum mechanics as well. A scale where the role of uncertainty becomes important in the physical world. Where do we come from? We come from the biological origins of life and the physical origins of life as well. And we've spent some time over the last few years talking about how we move from the origins of life to where we are today. That's the topic of evolution. Another big question, what lies ahead? What are the next steps for human beings? Trans and post-humanism, the immediate follow-on to evolution. Stewardship of our planet, really probably pretty important to the question of what lies ahead for us as humanity, depending heavily on the planet which we occupy. What lies ahead in form of technology, morality, ethics? What can we do? And maybe even more specifically, what should we do or not do? Medically, socially, economically. And what lies ahead? End state of the universe. Whether we think of the end state of the universe as sort of hyperbolic expansion, where we end up with a great big cold nothing, whether we think of the carefully balanced situation that would bring us to kind of an asymptotic end to the universe of some presumably finite scale, or whether the universe ends in what's sometimes referred to as the big crunch. Religious contexts of beginnings and endings, particularly prevalent in the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, depend on the issue that there's a beginning and an end. So what lies way ahead is an important issue as well. Addressing those big questions is a tall order, and we sure don't claim to have all the answers or even a comprehensive approach to answering them, but we're trying to make a start. Over the last 6 years, we have had a run at a little bit of each one of those questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? And there's a little bit of color coding involved there. We started in 2015 with Deborah and Lauren Harsema from BioLogos, helped us look at origins. literally from one of their books called Where Did We Come From? In 2016, already in the early pre-talk conversation, the name Justin Barrett came up. Justin has been with us in 2016. He's from the Fuller Graduate School of Theology, and he talked about brain science and sort of what makes us human. 2017, we talked about a topic of evolution and hope. I already introduced you to John Hout from Georgetown, one of my really favorite speakers that we have been able to attract to our forum. 2018, we looked more deeply at purposeful evolution, inviting Dennis Venom from Trinity Western University in Canada to be our guest. 2019, we attacked a question about who are we? Are you a robot? What is the role of brain, mind, and soul involved in distinguishing us from a robot? And Warren Brown from Fuller Seminary was with us then. And then last year, we attacked a broad range of topics: hope, nature, sin, and transhumanism. Are we making progress? Elaine Eklund from Rice University visited with us really at the end of the program last summer. Some of us had time to meet and to talk some with Elaine. And over time, I hope we're going to have some more time to talk about some of her work. Undoubtedly, we're not finished with any of these topics. We're going to circle back to these out in the future, I think. But here in 2021, we're working on those big questions by addressing a more fundamental question: why science and religion can or should interact at all. In any logical discussion, it's important to state sort of upfront the central assumptions that we make. The work of the forum starts from the fundamental assumption that there is an intersection between science and religion. Does such intersection really exist? And what gives us the justification to say so? This is in fact a question because some scholars and students of the area have postulated a variety of modes of interaction, including conflict, independence, dialogue, cooperation. Deladian Barber was a proponent of that particular hierarchy of interaction between faith and reason. Others formulate that spectrum a little bit differently. Elaine Eklund, for instance, points out that the conflict mode fundamentally implies a winner and a loser. Does science win? Does religion win? She spends a lot of time examining the attitudes of religious people and people of science and people of both, and their attitudes toward who wins. Eklund does not explicitly address the dialogue mode, but does talk about independence and about the cooperation mode. For what it's worth, her book, Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, includes some very interesting personal observations on her part, as well as a more narrative discussion about that intersection, at the intersection of faith and reason, religion and science. Hope we're going to have some chance in the future to talk some more about Eklund's work. More about this spectrum of interaction is going to be in Bob Dryge's talk in lecture number 4. So make sure you put Bob's talk on your calendar. Does such an intersection exist at all, and why do they interact? It's a question because the independence mode of interaction is by far the preferred mode among practicing scientists. This table is from Eklund's presentation for the forum last fall. In her book, Secularity and Science, she describes her extensive research that took place in what she calls 8 national contexts, 8 nations, 4 Western European derivative nations, the US, the UK, France, and Italy, and 4 others, the predominantly Islamic nation of Turkey, the predominantly Buddhist and Hindu nation of India, and then Hong Kong and Taiwan She doesn't say it explicitly, but sort of as surrogate for China, where it's difficult to do this kind of sociological research in China. Conclusion, the preponderance of practicing scientists who Eklund is surveying choose this independence mode as the way in which science and faith interact. In short, practicing scientists worldwide seem to want to duck the question. Given that, perhaps communities like Los Alamos should hold ourselves accountable to really understand this: why can and do science and faith interact? Even if scientists sort of statistically suggest that Elaine's statistical analysis suggests that scientists prefer the independence mode, any serious consideration of the big questions drives us, I think, to ask how religion can add depth and meaning to our lives and to our scientific endeavors as well. Galileo set the stage for the independence model of the interaction of science and religion, with his rather overquoted, I fear, statement: the Bible shows the way to go to heaven, and science shows the way the heavens go. But in contemporary times, John Paul II pulls those two back together, saying science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Pope John Paul II. You can hear more about this topic in lecture 6, 7, and 8, where 3 of our speakers are going to address just exactly how some of these issues of error and superstition, science and idolatry come together in the topic of the nature of Adam and Eve. One of my heroes, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who passed away this last year, but who interestingly continues to publish. Sachs knew that he was reaching the end of his earthly life, and he was writing prolifically right at the end of his life, and his material is still being published. In his book, The Great Partnership, Sachs sort of delivered a 2x4 upside my head in identifying the role of meaning as that which allows science and religion to talk to each other, and how they work together to provide meaning. That meaning, an important concept, which is sometimes generally lacking from the fundamental practice of science. Science legitimately doesn't ask about meaning. It doesn't ask about why the gravitational or Coulomb forces are central force fields diminishing as r squared. They don't ask why that is the case. But there may be huge meaning to how we apply gravitation and electromagnetism to how we interact with each other socially, economically, militarily, for better or worse. So, why should, can, or do faith and science interact? I guess I'd offer for your consideration 6 possibilities. Here's 4. Number 1, faith and reason share a common objective, asserting that there are fundamental that there are fundamentals of truth, and they're both looking to find it. They both reject complete relativism. Now, nothing really is founded on truth, and they each, however, use their own tools and their unique sets of data. We'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes. Number 2, faith and reason share a desire to address the same big questions. Nels Hoffman is going to talk about some of those big questions in lectures 2 and 3. Those big questions, as I mentioned before: who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? Faith and science interact because they share similar processes for thought and exploration. We're going to hear some more about that in lecture 4 and a little bit in lecture 5 as well. a process that's based on successive refinements of our understanding of observations, successive refinements that lead to more general principles. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in this talk. Faith and reason interact because they share similar values. That's one of the points that Elaine Eklund has brought out, and we'll talk very briefly about some of those as well. There's numbers 1 through 4, numbers 5 and 6. Faith and reason can and do interact because they can place boundary conditions on each other while still respecting each other and still respecting each other's unique approach and the data sets from which they come. Reason can impose some limits on what science can believe, and you're going to hear about that in lectures 6 through 8. Origin stories, Adam and Eve, but also destiny and end concepts. Not going to work on that this summer, but maybe we'll come back to that one in the future. Faith and reason interact because faith limits what science should do. Ethical practices, hear more about that in lectures 4, 5, and 9. Bioethics and medical ethics, very much in the forefronts right now. And Glenn Magelson is going to talk about some of those ethical issues when he talks about issues related to vaccination and a Christian response to vaccination. Cyber ethics, the news this morning was full of yet more news about violations of cyber ethics and what those do to the relationships between people. And of course, faith helps us limit what science should do, and the issue of weapons of mass destruction certainly fit right in that category. Finally, on my list of 6, faith and reason interact because they both address uncertainty, the uncertainty that seems to plague human thought. Nels touches on that a little bit in lectures 2 and 3. Uncertainty about life, about relationships, about death, about what comes next. Uncertainty about how sort of fundamental processes play out in quantum mechanical phenomena and all the way at large scale at phenomenology. We've just begun to scratch the surface of the role of uncertainty a couple of years ago when we talked about the role of hope in how we view the future. Lots more to say about that. Okay, a little bit more about 2 out of these 6 issues. Why do faith and reason interact? They share similar processes for thought and exploration. I'm beginning to get comfortable. It took a while, but I'm beginning to get comfortable that there is a common process for thought and exploration. It's not necessarily obvious that there is a common process, given the very different kinds of data sets with which faith and reason sometimes operate. The scientific method, about which we hear a lot in popular dialogue, maybe we ought to be calling it the scientific and religious method. Society in general isn't quite ready to take that leap yet, but I have some hopes that it may come about. The scientific method assumes that there are fundamental, global, static, sometimes pretty subtle and not even completely knowable general principles that govern the behavior of the physical and the scientific method doesn't talk about the spiritual world. We're going to look at that. This assumption that there are fundamental principles that govern the behavior of the world should be sort of comfortable both to folks who approach information processing from the side of reason and from folks who approach it from the side of faith. Both rely on the assumption that there are some underlying governing principles. The objective of the method is to kind of tease out those general principles from a sometimes uncooperative universe, or perhaps a sometimes slightly opaque revelation. Fundamentally, the scientific method uses observational data, that is, features of the world around us that we can measure in the case of science, or that we can articulate and observe in the case of faith, things that are also measurable and repeatable, things that are reliably repeatable, from which we infer or induce general principles that we can then apply. The core function of the scientific method is to refine our understanding of the general principles. We refine that, understanding by an iterative loop of formulating hypotheses. Those are guesses at what the general principle might look like, developing testable kinds of experiments, conducting those experiments, and iterating until our understanding gets a little bit better. Typically, we use the terminology hypothesis for an early guess, a theory for a more refined guess, and the most validated and generally applicable of theories become things we call laws. Laws resulting from the scientific method apply over a limited range of the available parameter space, a limited range, a limited portion of the universe. They don't apply everywhere. The tremendous scientific accomplishment of Newtonian mechanics in the 19th century applies wonderfully over the scale of micrometers to megameters, the sort of scale in which humans exist, but break down if we move outside of those sort of fundamental scales. While the general purpose of the scientific method is to refine a hypothesis into a theory and then into a law, the method can, at any stage, be used to make a prediction about a heretofore unexplored situation. The more refinement we've done in this iterative process, in the process of moving a hypothesis to a theory to a law, the better or the more reliable is the prediction. Newtonian mechanics has been tested in the last 300 years. And we have a pretty good idea of what happens if you put a marble on the top of an inclined plane and let it roll down. That is, if you're not Douglas Adams, who might find that marble stuck to the ceiling. That's a result of this refined work over hundreds of years to produce laws or general principles that can produce important and reliable predictions. Religious belief or church doctrines, I think, can be thought of as analogous to those general principles. And here's where I sort of run the risk of being burned at the stake for suggesting that initial observations in science can be likened to revelation in the case of a faith approach to processing information. We refine our understanding of revelation by comparing its content and applying it to real life situations. We test and refine what we learn from otherwise unchanging revelation. And like science, we arrive at divine laws that predict future outcomes, but which, like physical laws, do so over a limited range of applicability in space, time, or circumstance. I think you're going to see that point emerge a little bit through the summer series. You know, the lessons of Scripture and Revelation teach us that violating the fundamental components of the covenant at Sinai lead to bad outcomes. If we engage in lying or stealing or harming each other, bad things happen. That's applying a general principle to produce a predictable outcome. The same study of scripture and revelation, correctly applied, can be used to address issues like social justice and concepts of community policing here in the 21st century. We sometimes think of scientific or religious laws as forcing an outcome, that they're like civil laws that regulate behavior. Scientific laws don't regulate the outcome of circumstances in the physical world. The physical world regulates the outcomes. Scientific laws are tools to help us predict the outcome in situations where we may not already know the answer. More on these topics, and again, as I said before, in lectures 4 and 5 by Bob Dryja and Jerry Wood on ethical related issues. Topic number 2, why do science and faith interact? Because they share a common set of values or virtues, in addition to sharing that common process that I've just talked about. Elaine Eklund has developed a fascinating list of 8 such values or virtues, and she groups them into 2 categories that apply to both religion and science. Those related to the process of inquiry, that's kind of the process piece we just talked about, will be kind of familiar to you, and you'll sort of say, gee, yeah, those certainly apply to how we inquire about information. Curiosity, doubt, humility. Well, maybe humility really is kind of important, and creativity as we search for ways to put the information together. Elaine's second category are related to the concept of redemption, both physical and spiritual. Both science and religion place value on healing, on some concepts of awe. You regularly hear scientists talk about the awe and amazingness of the things that they look at, particularly those things that they don't quite understand. Shalom and gratitude. We only have time to talk even very briefly about 4 of those 8. So I pick out curiosity, wanting to gain a deeper understanding of the universe. Curiosity is asking about how that range of applicability we talked about earlier, how general principles are limited in their range of applicability. How can that range of applicability be broadened? And about the sort of feeling of dissatisfaction that we have when we know, when we don't quite know what is at the root of the questions. That motivates both science and faith. Doubt, questioning the general principles. I said the processing principle leads us to general principles, and we try to refine. Oh, if you're refining, you're constantly questioning, and especially questioning the limits of applicability. Where do the general principles apply and where do they not apply? Questioning is a mechanism for refining and strengthening both science and both reason and faith. On the side of the category of things that Elaine refers to as redemption, healing, reducing suffering, offering comfort through physical means or through psychological means. They both come together. They both result, we hope, they're both aimed at, have the objective of arriving at healing. And finally, shalom, promoting the benefit for others. And that can range from all kinds of physical and psychological benefit to issues like environmental justice and diversity as well. Sharing common processes, sharing common values. Good reasons, I think, for faith and reason to interact. Let me take you on a very quick tour through the summer series. You saw this list in Dan's material earlier. Just a few more words. Next week, Nels is going to kick off a 2-part series on the topic of how Christian Christianity has laid the foundations for modern science. The two parts, the psychology of Europe, Nels is going to start talking about relational processes in Europe from right after the collapse of the Roman Empire up to the early Middle Ages in the first part of his talk, and then pick up from the early Middle Ages with the work of the church in the second part of the talk. Nels is addressing one part of the big question, where did we come from? And he's looking specifically at Christianity in Western Europe and how that touches on where we as Western Christians may be going. We're then going to go into a two-part series, first lecture by Bob Dryja and the second one by Gary Wood. Bob is going to talk about some aspects of how faith and reason can reinforce each other when approached through the lens of ethics. Gary's going to talk about some of the impacts on people that the dialogue between faith and reason, religion and science can have as he explores the consequences of trying to use scientific results to influence doctrinal interpretations. Starting in July, we're going to have a three-part series by Chick Keller, Maury Pondgrants, and Gary Stradlin. Chick is going to lead off the series with three talks that address perhaps the poster child of the discussion at the intersection of faith and reason, religion and science. One of those pivotal where did we come from questions about Adam and Eve. Chick picks up on the issues of the mutual limitations that science and religion can impose upon each other that John Paul alluded to in the quote we saw earlier and that we've talked about just a moment ago. I personally love the title of Maury's talk because it gets at a question that's really deep in my heart. The connection between the scientific questions raised by the Adam and Eve narrative, the overall theology of the fall, and how does the concept of the fall relate to the big questions of who are we? And what do both theological and scientific questions mean to Christians in the context of our Christology? We're welcoming Gary Stradlin to our list of speakers for the forum for the first time this year. We're really glad to have Gary with us. And he's going to talk about the narrative of Adam and Eve from the standpoint of evolutionary history and how they enabled the explosive success of the species that we call mankind. In some ways, Gary is going to offer a bit of a counterpoint to Chick and Maury's talk, and that's just incredibly healthy. Together, these three talks offer a great example of dialogue invoking both science and religion, and does so across a variety of faith traditions. And if that isn't living deeply into the mysteries of science and faith, I don't quite know what is. So I'm really looking forward to hearing these three talks. I've heard a little bit, and I can assure you they are a really interesting set. We're going to wrap up the summer with Glenn Madelson talking about a very contemporary application at the intersection of faith and reason, religion and science. Glenn's going to be talking about the whole process of vaccination, the Christian response to it, highlighting both the scientific and the religious side, both the reason and the faith side of what's really a hot button issue in today's news. You can tune into any media from Fox to CNN and hear all about vaccinations and a variety of reactions to that. It'll be great to hear Glenn counterpoint those reactions in the final talk on the 28th of June. So why can faith and science interact? Well, I've offered 6 reasons, and talked in some detail about 2 of them. I hope you'll be able to come to the rest of the summer series, because we're going to, as I've tried to outline here, we're going to delve across several of these reasons in the upcoming lectures. We've talked a little bit about each one, certainly have not exhausted that possibility by any stretch of the imagination. So I hope I'll be able to say hello to you, to each of you on the next 8 Wednesdays. So thanks very much for indulging me, for listening to me tonight. And if you really want to ask yourself questions, ask which of these sort of 6 ways in which science and faith interact are the most important in your point of view, and which of them may drive the discourse most importantly today. They may or may not be the same answer. Some may be very important to you, and some may be driving the discourse in some different ways today. So thanks very much. Back to you, Dan.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Okay, let's see. We have some questions in chat, okay? And we just saw a message from Susan about adding your questions to chat. And so Nels, are you going to take over now and ask?
Sure, I can do that, Don.
Yeah, okay, good. Thanks. Go ahead, Nels.
Yeah, Victoria Earhart has entered a question in the chat and asks, Bob, can you speak a bit more about how initial observations are analogous to revelations? The revelations I think of offhand contradict most of what was accepted as true or normal up to the point of a specific revelation.
Sure, thanks, Vicki. Let's see. Let me try that again. Sorry, folks. Let's see. I want to go there. And I want to go here and here. So, Vicki, this is where I run the risk of getting burned at the stake, and I understand that. If we think of this, the sort of what I like to think of as similar processes, we start with observations. So in the physical sciences, we start with observations of the world. I think in the faith side, we start with some fundamental inputs that we call revelation. That can be revelation from Scripture, or it can be any of the other forms of revelation that we encounter in the world, either after the closure of Scripture, depending on the faith tradition from which you come. I think my point is that if we are, the similarity of the process of thought and exploration is that we start from those revelations and we try to refine our understanding. We're not trying to change those revelations or make those revelations, remake them in some form. We start with them, but what we are reforming is our understanding of where those revelations lead and where the general predictions that come from those revelations help us make choices for the way we live together as human beings on the planet. Vicki, do you want to unmute and respond if that isn't getting close to your question?
Okay, thanks very much, Bob. Great talk, by the way. Great talk. Okay, so I'm thinking of just revelations. God picks Moses. And the first realization is, I'm the God that brought you out of the land of Egypt, and there's one and one only. That's a kind of revelation we would not have come to either through observation in an entirely polytheistic world or through human reason. There's no inherent necessity for monotheism.
But that is offered to us as an input condition, isn't it?
Yes,
when we
but it
when we
doesn't come
hear about the revelation of the burning bush,
but
you
it
know,
doesn't
that's
come from
an
any-
input condition.
That's not an observation. It doesn't come from any observation. I would not be able to argue or think my way towards this by looking at the world. And then Jesus comes and turns the value system upside down. And that's not something I would come to.
Oh, okay.
And Buddha comes and gives us again a vastly different interpretation of how we should be and act in the world. And these are not things that I would come to on my own.
And they're of course not things that you would observe in the same way that you would observe the phases of the moon or the motion of the planets or my marble rolling down an inclined plane. I'm not suggesting that revelation is observable in the same way that the inputs to the scientific process are observable. But they are and in my view, and off I go to the stake, they are the beginning of a process of refining our understanding. And
Okay, I will give you that. We get this revelation, and now we have to figure out how things are different as a result of that revelation.
yes,
Okay.
how things are different, and how do we make today's choices? How do
Okay.
we make choices about social justice or community policing or international conflict?
Okay, I'll give you that one. Thank you.
Okay. Vicki, thank you so much for being part of this dialogue. You're a tremendous asset. When are you going to give us a talk?
I don't know. We'll have to think about it.
Back to you, Nels.
We have another question from Marie Bartholdi, and she asks, can you explain the term shalom? I believe it means peace in Hebrew. Why was it chosen for the concepts you described?
Fair enough. Peace, justice. You're right. The shalom is frequently translated from the Hebrew as peace. And then you ask, what is peace? Peace can be mental and spiritual security or comfort. It can also be promoting the benefit of others. So as a shared value for this ongoing process of refining how we understand things, the idea that what we do in science and in the world of faith is promoting the benefit of others, building relationships with others, is kind of how I get to, well, I can't take credit for it, how Elaine Eklund gets to adding shalom as one of the virtues. She's using it in a much broader term than just the geopolitical concept of peace as the absence of armed conflict, or even just as peace as a sort of comfort in our soul. It's benefiting the life of and the life and relationships of others. Does that help at all? Nels?
Oh, Victoria, Vicky Earhart just answered another chat item saying that shalom from the three-letter Semitic root SLM, meaning submission, as in submission to God's or Allah's will. So that's a comment from Vicky.
Thank you, Vicky.
And Maury Pongratz made a comment that revelation leads to doctrine the way observations lead to laws.
And I would invite everybody to come back and hear more from several of our speakers who are going to several of the talks are going to have variants of comments about the scientific, I'd love to say the scientific / religious method. So you're going to hear some slightly different views of how that process works. So keep coming back. Thank you, Maury.
That's all of our comments and questions so far. So Dan, I'll let you take over.
Well, Nels, I have a question. Okay, I didn't put it in chat because I don't know how to formulate my question, but I do have a question for you, Bob, after your very excellent talk. One of the things that you didn't mention, and I didn't know why you wouldn't mention it anyway, is this old idea of the anthropic principle, okay? Namely that science shows us that there are, a very narrow range of certain values for certain physical constants or certain other things that have to be just right in order for the universe to evolve to where we are now. And the question is, that's what my problem is. I'm having trouble formulating a question. Do you think that means that by doing that science is boxing God in at some level, or is the anthropic principle mean that God is sort of leading science in a certain direction to uncover certain things? That's what I don't know how to answer the question.
Well, maybe we can make a whole summer out of that one.
Because when you start talking about it, that idea came, that's an old idea. And when you put up Ian Barber's book, I think about that also. So,
but the anthropic principle is sort of an observation. I think it's an observation of a number of finely tuned parameters.
Yeah.
Now, what you do with that, I think in part depends on whether you approach completely from the standpoint of reason, particularly from the standpoint of faith, or for those of us who can't make up our mind from having one foot in both camps. Some folks would say that fine tuning is evidence of a creation that could only have come about by an extremely capable designer, God. Mm-hmm. So one sense is that finely tuned set of parameters is hard evidence for a creation driven by a creator. Other folks would say the other way to look at it is change some of those parameters, and you probably won't have life as we know it today. We won't be sitting here looking at a Zoom screen. Change some of those parameters, and you might have a very, very different universe.
Wow.
But not necessarily one that is devoid of, interestingly enough, creativity and questioning and curiosity and shalom and those other values. I wouldn't rule that out.
Okay. Well, thanks, Bob.
I've got a quick question or comment. One of the problems, I think, in trying to look at things through both those lenses is people will say, that's okay, but there are some scientific beliefs. I mean, some beliefs that we have, and no matter what science says, it can't change those beliefs because they're revelation, and revelation is the truth. And I think that for this way of thinking to work, we have to be able to say, no, there are going to be times when science will rule out certain classic ideas that religion has and make you modify them. Might not falsify them, but it'll make you modify them. And if you refuse to admit that that can happen, then we don't really have much of a discussion. And I don't think enough emphasis is put, people are very reluctant to say, you know what, a scientific finding could say that something I believe is wrong or is not allowed. And people don't really want to deal with that. They want to say, oh, you know, science will always back up what we believe. And I don't think we have a valid discussion unless we're ready to admit that some of our traditional age-old ideas need to be modified in light of what science is telling us.
Here, Chick, elaborate on a specific application of the general principles that he just outlined.
Pardon?
No,
You want me-
I was encouraging folks to come and hear your talk.
Yeah, that will be, you know, if you aren't willing to do that, then my talk isn't going to do you much good.
Mhm. Okay. Are there any other questions out there? Are we ready to wrap this up for the evening? I think so.
I just wanted to respond.
Sure.
Maury put something, it's just an extraordinary statement. The revelation of the gospel leads to the doctrine, like the creed, the Apostles' Creed, perhaps, like marbles rolling down the inclined plane led to law of gravity. I could spend the rest of my life trying to figure that one out, Maury.
We hope you do.
I don't know how you can think your way to creedal statements the way I could think my way to what has to be causing these marbles to roll down an inclined plane.
Let me have a quick go at answering that. What we have on religions and faith is revelation. What you have in science is data, observations. The scientist takes the data and says, what does this mean? What can I make of this? Are there any general principles? You know, da-da-da-da. The theologian takes the data, revelation, and says, what does this mean? What can I make of it? Where can I go with it? And so they're really sort of doing the same thing. They're both looking at the truth and making their interpretation of the truth. And religions sometimes all get together and interpret the truth the same way. Sometimes they don't. But the point of the matter is to say that we have revelation and that's the truth, and therefore that's different from science, is not quite right, because we can have revelation, but then we have to interpret it what it means. And when we try to do that, that's theology. And when we try to do that, we're doing pretty much the same thing with faith as scientists are doing with their observations.
Thank you, Chick. That's what I meant.
Okay. Anyone else have anything else we want to say? Yes, no? I have a final thing I'm supposed to say. Bob, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, and for all of you who joined us tonight, and hopefully we'll continue throughout this 9-week series. We'd like to offer you our thanks. We especially thank you for your patience as we're Zooming here. We do continue to check the website for updates. Please do that, and for updates about the work of the forum and for more information about future events. If you have any comments about this evening's presentation and you want to share it, you can put them on the website. There's a button there to add in comments. And that's about it. So I hope you can come back next week. Nels is going to give the first of his 2 talks. And so I would say good night, everyone. And I thank you for coming. And we enjoyed having you. And we look forward to it's going to be a great summer. I'm glad you could join us tonight. Good night. Thank you.
Have a good night and see you next week.
Bye-bye. Sure.